Hello students and welcome to SOC 101 with me, Professor Justine Hecht. Today we're getting into the issue of social construction of race and the wages of whiteness. Typically when we talk about race, we tend to think about people of color very specifically, right? But very rarely do we actually talk about how being white is also a race, right? And how whiteness itself is socially constructed. Now we spent some time in the beginning of the semester, and particularly the last couple of weeks, talking about racial discrimination against Black folks and how that's informed by poverty and all these different things, right? And so this week we're going to spend some time thinking about what it means for whiteness itself to be socially constructed. So in order to start thinking about what it means when we say race is not, or race is socially constructed, we have to first remember or figure out what race is not, right? So it's not biological, it's not neutral, it's not an ethnicity, it's not just an identity, it's not universal, and it's not a fiction, right? And so race is socially constructed, which means we made it up, but it has real impacts on people's lives, which is why it's not a fiction, right? It's a very real story that has to be continually reinforced over and over again, specifically because it's not real, right? And so when I say race is not biological, right, that doesn't mean that, like, our DNA doesn't determine how dark or light-skinned we're going to be, right? But what it does mean is that there is no biological basis to suggest that one racial group is superior or inferior to another. This is how it used to be argued that slavery was justified. They argued that Black people, African people, were actually biologically inferior to white people. And because of that natural, quote unquote, biological difference, right, this justified the rule of white folks over that of Black folks, essentially, right? So we know that there is no actual evidence to suggest that any racial identity would make you more or less smart than any other group, right? More or less capable than any other group, right? And what this means then too, like that race was constructed for a particular reason. So it's not neutral. It's not just about individual prejudice. It's about how race gets taken up by social systems to shape the social order from which we live, right? So if you want to learn more about this idea, you can watch this video by Vox, and it will go over this in a little bit more detail. All right, so if race is not these things, then what is it? Professor Joel Olson of political science at Northern Arizona University, he writes that race organizes people into groups. Right? One group or race receives preferential treatment at the expense of other groups. And because of this, it becomes a system of discrimination and hierarchy and power that functions to preserve the privileges of the dominant race at the expense of every other race. So what we start to see here is that race is an organizing structure. It positions different groups in different places in our social order, right? So we were talking about like stratification last week, right? Race is going to complicate that class analysis a little bit, right? It's not just class that organizes you into your social into your social position in the level of stratification. It's also race and class, right? So and so we can kind of see how this happens by looking back at the history of the formation of whiteness as a racial identity in the United States. Really the first time we start seeing Black and white being used to identify workers in the United States is with the first slave ship in 1619. And it's not super clear then, right? But we do start to see that the people who are coming from Africa are being marked as Black, and the people who are being indentured from Europe, I'll explain that in just a second, right, are being marked as white. There's not a lot of meaning associated with that yet, right? It's just a way to differentiate these groups. So obviously we know that in the United States we relied on slave labor, where folks were forcibly taken from their homes in Africa and then brought to the United States to work for essentially free for landowners, right? So in the United States as well, we also had indentured servants. So these were poor white folks from Europe who did not have enough money to pay for their own passage across the Atlantic. And so what they would do then is that they would sell their labor to a landowner or to a ship owner for a certain period of time to pay for that passage. So you might say, hey, ship owner, I want to go live in the quote unquote new world. I will sell you my labor for 5 years so that you will take me across the Atlantic. Now, oftentimes we understand that like the conditions of enslaved ships were terrible and that many people didn't survive. Many Black people didn't survive the experience of even crossing from Africa to the quote unquote New World. But what we often don't know is that the conditions on indentured servant ships were also just as atrocious. So people like packed in, like shoulder to shoulder, no place to go to the bathroom other than where you stand, right? And the trip across is a long trip, right? So it takes some time and is unpleasant to say the least, right? And so we often had even indentured servants not surviving their trip over. Then the conditions of indentured servitude were often so severe that people would not actually survive until the end of their service. Right? And so now plenty of people did survive, obviously, right? And the difference between indentured servitude and slavery is that indentured servitude comes with a time limit, 5 to 7 years. Slavery is lifelong, right? And so there are differences already emerging, right, in the organization of these racial groups into different labor categories, right? And so we really start to see how this organization of people into different racial groups starts to get cemented after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 in Jamestown, Virginia. So here's a whole little video where you can watch like a fun, it's difficult history, but like an interesting artistic rendition and song about Bacon's Rebellion. I highly recommend it. Basically what had happened was in Jamestown, Virginia in 1676, there was a small landowner, white landowner named Nathaniel Bacon. He was concerned that the European powers were not sending enough military support to fend off the attacks from indigenous people, Native Americans, who were defending their land from white settlers, right? And so in order to get European powers to send more military support to folks settling the land in what will become the United States, he organizes small landowners, poor whites, and enslaved blacks to have a uprising against the elites of Jamestown at that particular time. It lasts for about 2 weeks. It's actually going really well. Bacon and his crew seem to be winning, and then Bacon dies from dysentery, a very, Oregon Trail kind of moment, right? The rebellion continues for a little while, but it really starts to slow down after Bacon dies. And so the military captain, Thomas Grantham, he says that, hey, if y'all just surrender, we're going to pardon the poor whites and we're going to free the black slaves. So they surrender. And then he immediately returns enslaved people back to their masters and continues the servitude of poor whites. And then 23 rebel leaders were actually hanged, right? And so it does not end well for those in rebellion necessarily, right? But what's even more interesting is that after this rebellion happens, this is when we start to see laws that get put into place to encourage poor whites to see themselves as different from enslaved black people. Right? So we see the banning of interracial marriage. We see increased years of servitude for white indentured servants who are caught running away with black slaves. We see laws that say things like, if there's 3 black people gathered, a white person can't gather with them, right? All these kind of different things that start to really divide poor white people and poor black people, quite honestly, right? We also see that there's incentives for not running away with black slaves, right? So first of all, your servitude isn't going to be extended. We also see things that, like, if you run away with a black slave, then you will lose your bushel of corn that you're supposed to get at the end of your servitude. You will lose the land that you're supposed to get at the end of your servitude, right? These different types of things. We see certain privileges, right, being threatened, right, for the fear of interracial mixing at the level of the working and lower classes, right? And so W.E.B. Du Bois will go on to call this the psychological wages of whiteness. Now, we may remember from Module 3, W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the founding fathers of modern sociology, where he used sociology, right, as a tool to understand racial inequality in Philadelphia. Right, so this book is from his book called Black Reconstruction, where he's talking about the experience of the Civil War and then the aftermath of the Civil War. Right, obviously the Civil War then is fought over slavery. And so I'm going to let you read this for yourself because I only have a short amount of time on this recording device, right? But what you can see here, right, is although white workers, white laborers received a low financial wage, They were compensated in part by a psychological wage, given access to public spaces, right? Able to go to any park that they want to go to, able to go to the best schools, right? Police are drawn from their ranks. Courts depend on their votes, right? And so they are treated with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness, right? Their vote selects the public officials, so on and so forth, right? And so while although this psychological wage doesn't do anything to address the low economic wage they receive, right? It does create the space in which you can say, I may be poor, but at least I'm not black. At least I'm not a slave, right? And so it really starts to create this idea of superiority within folks who are positioned as white, right? In contrast, right, to the psychological wages of whiteness is black subordination, where the black man was subject to public insult, was afraid of mobs, was liable to the jibes of children and the unreasoning fear of white women, and compelled almost continually to submit to various badges of inferiority, right? So whereas white folks get deferences, right, black folks get subordination. And we can think about how this normalizes the United States as a country of white people, because white people have access to the social goods that black people do not, right? So Joel Olson is going to go on to talk about this as being a cross-class alliance between the white working class and the capitalist class at the expense of the not white working class. So he's building on W.E. Du Bois' argument here, essentially, right? The capitalist class are those who assert effective control over economic production. So you can think like bosses. In our modern day and age, you can think like corporations, right? Employers, broadly speaking, right? And the working class is everybody else. Those whose capacity to work is the only tool for survival. The only thing we have to sell is our labor, essentially, right? And we don't have as much effective control over economic production. Right, and so a class then is a group of people whose lives are determined or significantly influenced by their position in the production of economic resources, right? So typically the working class would be organized and in solidarity with one another against the capitalist class. The capitalist class controls the working conditions. The working conditions are not always great, right? And so the workers all have an interest in trying to pressure the owner, right, to change the working conditions in one way or the other. We can see this all over the place right now. There's massive strikes happening in the United States recently, and that is what's happening, is that the working class is organizing together to demand increase in wages, right, to demand better, safer working conditions, better benefits, so on and so forth, right? And so what happens with the psychological wage of whiteness, Olson argues, and building on Du Bois, right, is that it creates an alliance between white workers and the capitalist class, in which white workers should have an interest in not aligning with the capitalist class, right? But because they see themselves as different from, racially different from non-white workers, right? What this does is essentially divides the working class so that they are ineffective in organizing against the capitalist class to reclaim that power and reshape those economic conditions, right? And so what this means then is that whiteness as a racial identity is a position of racial standing and privilege within a democratic society. The dominant category in the cross-class alliance that constructs the U.S. social order, granting democratic rights and privileges to its members when while denying them to those who are not. It's an interest in and an expectation of favored treatment within a democratic system, right? So Olson continues on to say that the tragedy of the cross-class alliance is that in exchange for such psychological wages, poor whites maintain the system that exploits them as well. Right, so we can think about arguments that suggest that we should lower welfare payments, right? When we know that white people are actually on welfare at higher rates than are people of color. But because there is a stereotype that associates welfares with black people and migrant people in particular, right? And then even poor whites who can benefit from those social systems will often argue against them because they see themselves as different from these other non-white groups, essentially, right? And so this last slide, I only got a minute here, right, illustrates the way in which the United States was positioned as a white country, particularly in this statement right here. So this is after the Mexican-American War, when we incorporate what is now California, Arizona, New Mexico, so on and so forth as the United States. We take that from Mexico and we include it in the United States. At that point in time, we're trying to figure out how to incorporate Mexican people into the United States. And John C. Calhoun, who is a congressman, right, he says that the United States has always been a white nation, right? And so what does it mean to include Mexicans or Indians as citizens, right, in our nation? And so when you're thinking about race this week, you're thinking about the Great Conspiracy Theory. How does whiteness shape belonging through normalization in the United States? All right, that's all I got. Take care, folks.